Welcome to CapitolView, a weekly look at the happenings inside and outside the Illinois State Capitol. I'm Jennifer Fuller. Our guests this week are Peter Hancock of Capitol News Illinois and Jason Piscia, the director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Gentlemen, I appreciate you joining us. Let's get right to it. The big news across the nation, really across the world this week, is the massacre in Texas, another school shooting. And reaction to this on the political line has fallen mainly along partisan lines, as you might expect. Peter, just judging from what we're hearing in the Illinois congressional delegation as well as state lawmakers, is there going to be any movement in the near future to change gun legislation either in the state of Illinois or perhaps at the national level?
Well, I think the short answer to that is no, certainly not at the national level. The lines have been drawn. It doesn't seem to matter how many of these horrific, tragic mass shootings happen around the country. The people who believe in gun rights say that gun control won't do anything to help. And the people who want guns more controlled don't have the votes to push it through. So here in Illinois, we actually do have some pretty strict gun laws. And in Chicago in particular, they have even stricter local laws. And I don't think there are the votes in the General Assembly to change any of those. It was kind of interesting how Chicago got dragged into this. I think the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, made some remark about how Chicago has the strictest gun laws in the country, and yet they have all these murders. And then Governor Pritzker jumped in and said that's because guns are being taken into Chicago from other states that have lax gun laws. So really and this is what is just so frustrating, I think, for everybody, is that every single time something like this happens, we get the same arguments and nothing changes.
Do you think that there's any energizing of the electorate that could change the way that this goes? Is this the final straw for any people, and it may change the way they vote either in June or in November?
Oh, I don't know. I thought Sandy Hook would have done that. And I certainly thought that the shooting in Florida at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School was going to do that. The Florida shooting did seem to energize the youth vote across the country. People 18 to 25 turned out in record numbers, which was encouraging. It's possible that this one might have the same effect. It will energize a certain amount of the base, but there can also be a backlash where if the gun control advocates start making too much noise, that'll cause a backlash for this, and the Second Amendment rights people will get motivated. So I think it cuts both ways.
Sure. Jason, crime has already been a big part of the gubernatorial campaign here in Illinois, with Republicans saying that crime is a problem, each one of them having their own remedy for solving some of those crime problems, particularly in the city of Chicago. Does this change that messaging in your mind?
Not much. I think the Republicans will still stay with their, talking points of, we're not going to touch the Second Amendment. People have rights to have firearms, and we're not going to do anything to change that. And I think it all comes down to the national level. It's what can we get through the U.S. Senate, which at this point is nothing. It's a logjam from the get-go. We did hear the Republican candidates for governor speak about crime and this issue as well, mass shootings, at their pair of debates earlier this week, and we'll probably talk more about that later. But and just what we saw with what those candidates were talking about, really, there's no interest in doing any large-scale reforms. There's some minor talk of adjusting, FOID card regulations. One of the candidates talked about how, we just need to rely on God and fatherhood to help solve this problem. So, not really much wherewithal to do anything there. And in terms of crime, Darren Bailey, Republican state senator from Southern Illinois, sort of had the quote of the night during those debates about calling Chicago sort of a crime-infested, corrupt hellhole, which, probably can cut both ways for him. It's really going to play to his, deep red base in Southern and Central Illinois, who already believe Chicago is the worst place in the world anyway. But I think it could speak to some Chicago residents as well, who maybe are tired of that. Although we did hear a lot of, criticism from, Chicago officials and other Chicago boosters about how, that's not fair. We're doing the best we can. So yeah, I really don't see much of a change in how this is going to go from a politician standpoint.
Yeah, you bring up those debates, a pair of debates on one night, two different times, two different stages with the candidates split between those. And, one of the other questions that they were asked was, would you call out the National Guard to handle the crime situation in Chicago or potentially in other areas of the state? Jason, what do you take from the answers to that question?
There was not, Richard Irvin all along has said, he called out the National Guard when he was mayor of Aurora during the George Floyd protests a couple of years ago. And there's been fact checks on that, obviously, that mayors can't actually call out the National Guard. That's the governor's job. But yeah, there didn't seem to be much agreement on whether, the governors they thought Chicago needed it right now. So yeah, it was just a thought that, the Chicago or the National Guard is needed, but, no one really would commit one way or the other to, calling them out immediately.
Peter, when it comes to other issues that were brought up in those two debates, do any of the answers, do any of the questions move the needle when it comes to voters in your mind? Do you see, someone emerging either as the overall frontrunner, or is it still close between Richard Irvin and Darren Bailey?
Oh, I think it's still close between Irvin and Bailey. Televised debates like that don't tend to move the needle very far. They don't get real high ratings for the most part. And at this point, voting has already started in Illinois. And I think the people who are going to vote have pretty much made up their mind. The latest poll we saw showed a significant number of undecided voters. Those may very well be the people who don't turn out. There's not a whole lot of error between the two candidates when you listen to them. They're both tough on crime. Darren Bailey is outspokenly against abortion rights. You can't really get much of an answer out of Richard Irvin on that. But within the Republican Party, that they're going to expect their nominee to be pro-life. So I think, it's going to come down to turnout. I think Darren Bailey is going to be more popular south of I-64. I think Richard Irvin will be more popular north of I-80. It's that area in between that has a lot of Republican votes that'll probably decide it.
You mentioned the undecided in the last several polls, and in many cases it's polling more than 30%. So more than a third of likely Republican voters still aren't quite sure who they're going to vote for. How much of a burden is that for whoever the nominee is heading into November? I'm going to let both of you answer. Peter, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the campaigns have to really be scratching their heads because Richard Irvin and Darren Bailey have both spent a lot of money getting their name and their message out there on television, on radio, through the internet, streaming services. You can't turn around without seeing them somewhere. And the fact that there's a large number of undecided votes, I don't know, maybe Paul Schimpf has a pathway to get in there. It's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, and
Jason?
Peter, you mentioned, the great amount of money that's being spent, and on Irvin's side especially, the great amount of money comes from the pockets of Ken Griffin, the richest man in Illinois. So he's probably also scratching his head about whether what he can do to sort of break through to that sector of undecided voters. And it'll just be interesting to see what tactics they take. Personally, I'd like to see them both on the same debate stage. I know with the strange way the debates were set up this past week, where NBC5 in Chicago had one, WGN in Chicago also put one together, and WGN put out their invitation first, and Bailey accepted that, but Irvin didn't, and then Irvin took the NBC5 one, and then, so we have these two debates, and we sort of, Irvin wasn't able to defend himself when Bailey called him a mini Mike Madigan, trying to tie him again to, the thought that Irvin is actually a Democrat in disguise. So, there is another, I think it's a League of Women's Voter debate coming up next week on Thursday, I believe, June 2nd. Irvin has accepted. Bailey says he has a date conflict, some sort of a Republican Day dinner up in the suburbs. So I think for the sake of the voters, especially the ones who are interested in voting early, we can see these two candidates side by side. Yes, they have appeared side by side on newspaper editorial boards around the state, but granted, those don't get as much play as a wide television audience would.
It's evidenced here, this issue that the gubernatorial race is taking up most of the time, attention, and money in the races across the state of Illinois, both in the primary, and we'll likely see the same thing heading into the general. I wanted to talk about those down ballot races, still statewide candidates, but a lot of them not getting the attention or perhaps even the traction that they may need to make it through the primary and head into the general. There is one open seat in this November's general election. That'll be for Illinois Secretary of State. And both Republicans and Democrats have multiple candidates in that race running. I don't want to put a handicap on it, but Peter, how is that race looking? It appears to me to be one of the more interesting.
It is. And I think of all of the statewide races, that's the one where Republicans probably have the biggest shot at gaining an office. Right now, every statewide elected office in Illinois is held by Democrats. Democrats hold super majorities in both chambers of the legislature. But in the Secretary of State's race, on the Democratic side, you have Alexi Giulianius, a former state treasurer, and Anna Valencia, who's the Chicago city clerk. Both of them apparently have some significant issues hanging around them. And most recently, Valencia is being accused of using the city clerk's office to steer city jobs to her husband, lobbyist. And on the Republican side, the two major candidates are Dan Brady, state representative from Bloomington, and a former U.S. attorney, Millhiser, and both of them seem to be fairly popular and likable people. Dan Brady's been in the General Assembly for quite a while. I think he's generally respected on both sides of the aisle. So, and the former U.S. attorney obviously has a pretty significant base here. And so of all of the races, I think that's the one where Republicans might have a shot.
Jason, do you agree?
Yeah. Like I said, Secretary of State has such a high profile office. If you pull out your driver's license right now, the Secretary of State's name is across the top of it. And it's, on the door of every DMV in the state. When you get your license plate renewal thing, envelope in the mail, his name's on it as well. Jesse White has held that office. The Democrat has held it since 1999? What is that, 6 terms or something like that? Which is just crazy to think about. And the Secretary of State also is historically in Illinois sort of been a stepping stone to bigger and better things. Jim Edgar, George Ryan, for example, both of them held that office before they went on to be governor. So yeah, like Peter was saying, the Democratic candidates sort of have some credibility issues that they need to work through. John Milhiser, you know, we talked about how they're not getting much name recognition or attention at this point, but John Milhiser especially is getting some money. The Griffin-backed Irvin campaign sent $500,000 Milhiser's way on Friday. And Milhiser's already up on television around the state with an introductory ad talking about himself. He's well known in the Springfield area. He was Sangamon County State's attorney for many years, and then served as a federal prosecutor in the Central District of Illinois in the U.S. court system. He talks a lot in his ads about fighting corruption and sort of being kind of playing off of his law enforcement legal roots. Doesn't actually match up with the duties of the Secretary of State's office, but that's okay. It makes for a good ad, right? So yeah, I do think if there can be some, I'd like to see a debate, but in that race, and just talk about some of the issues. I'd like to hear some issues on how DMV services would be improved, and other things that the Secretary of State actually does to give people a better idea of how this race goes. But yeah, I agree. This will be one of the more compelling races to watch, especially because if you win, you get your name on every driver's license in Illinois.
Sure. Still other statewide offices, including the Attorney General's office, the Controller, the Treasurer, each of those have an incumbent that likely will be in the general election. But there is also that Republican slate, Jason, you mentioned it, backed by Ken Griffin and the Irvin campaign. Is that going to be, in your mind, what to watch? Is do those candidates who are attached to Richard Irvin make it through the primary if there's a challenge there, and then you follow from there? Are we talking about a coattail effect, for lack of a better phrase?
Yeah, I think definitely in these down ballot races where it's hard to get the general public's attention on, how many people can even name off the top of their head like what the comptroller does. We all know because we live it every day, but the general Illinoisan might not have a clear view on what that is. So it's all going to come down to name recognition. The money buys that name recognition, and if Griffin is committed to funding the slate as much as he has so far with Milhiser, and also his Attorney General candidate Steve Kim got another $300,000 last week as well. So we probably will start seeing some media from him as well. But it's going to come down to the name recognition, and money buys that. You hate to say that money buys elections, but sometimes that does, especially in these down ballot races where people don't really engage with what the issues are and the functions of the office that they're seeking.
Peter, is there any opportunity, you talk about a coattail effect, and that's from the top down, but is there any opportunity for some of the issues or some of the candidates to impact things higher up on the ballot when you talk about a gubernatorial race?
Well, yeah, and I would disagree with Jason just a little bit here. Yeah, name recognition is important, but more and more these days, it's party identification. People vote for party rather than, for a name that they recognize. They might recognize a name as somebody they don't especially like. So I think when you get to the general election, it's going to be more about party than about particular issues. And, I don't know. I mean, if you assume for the sake of argument that Governor Pritzker has a leg up going in, he can probably, pull in a number of down ballot Democrats with him. I have little doubt that Democrats will keep majorities in the state, in the General Assembly. Not quite so sure that they will keep super majorities in both chambers. That'll be interesting to watch. But I generally speaking, I think it's going to be more about party than about anything else.
It's easy to spend a lot of time talking about elections, prognosticating about what may or may not happen, what may or may not influence voters. One of the things that will impact the state for years to come, and we've talked about this in the past, we're going to continue talking about it, is the U.S. Census and the count that was officially certified, and then what the census is finding from additional surveys and counts. And Peter, you've got a story out this week that takes a look at what many are calling a revision or an update to the 2020 census, but it showed that there was likely an undercount in the state of Illinois. What's all that going to mean when it comes to how Illinois is represented or how money goes back and forth to Washington?
Well, it has no impact on representation in Congress. What the Census Bureau did was after the survey, and they do this after the census, they do this every 10 years, is they go out and do what's called a post-enumeration survey. And it's something they do to try and assess the quality of the data that you have in the actual census. Some people, Governor Pritzker put out a press release saying he's urging the Biden administration to fund Illinois based on the revised or the updated numbers. There is a lot of federal money that goes out on a formula basis that uses the census as one of the determining things about how much money a state gets. But the numbers have not been updated. They have not been revised. They have not been corrected. If you go to the Census Bureau website, it will show and look up what the population of Illinois was in the 2020 census. They're going to say it was around 12.8 million people. According to this survey, Illinois did not see a population decline. If you go by the survey, there may have been an increase in population of as much as 250,000 people. So they're now some people are now claiming that Illinois' population is actually just over 13 million people. That's not the number that the Census Bureau is going to report. Some states were undercounted, some states were overcounted. And I think if you want to convince the federal government that states should be funded on the basis of population estimates from this survey rather than from the actual census, then you have to not only increase funding for the states that were undercounted, but you have to decrease funding for states that were overcounted. The most overcounted state, according to that survey, was Delaware at a little over 5%. Delaware is the home state of President Joe Biden. So, good luck convincing the Biden administration to cut funding for his home state.
Jason, when you talk about the census, people get very territorial, but they also get very passionate about, well, that's not entirely accurate, or this is not entirely accurate. You're seeing communities that may have to be making decisions based on home rule. Will they still have home rule status, or do they have to put it back on the ballot this year? Does this estimate, in your mind, change how people talk about this?
It's definitely, we didn't want to talk about the election much more, but it's become part of the narrative of the campaigns as well. Pritzker was taking a victory lap this week on, how about the economy is booming and the population is up and things are great. And how dare the Republicans say everything is horrible in Illinois because, look, the numbers are better. But as Peter pointed out, the official census population number of Illinois has not changed. We are still at whatever it is, 12.8 million. And, and meanwhile, Republicans are using this opportunity as well to remind people, well, the post-enumeration survey did look good for Illinois, but, Illinois, we still lost a representative in the U.S. House. Which reduces Illinois' influence in presidential elections and other things like that. Illinois still has a high property tax problem. The Republicans say there's still crime problems. So things are not all roses and good times here in Illinois because the population appears to have gone up. Both sides are sort of using this as a way to still back up their thoughts on where we stand policy-wise in Illinois.
Sure. Peter, just a minute or so that we have remaining. This is obviously, the census becomes a political issue. There are people that are talking about it being alternative facts or things like that. People are choosing which number to believe. How should people be looking at this if they're not involved in politics? How should this impact what they see about the state they live in?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how the census numbers, people take it as a reflection of the rest of the nation's opinion about your state. If people are moving to your state, then they must love it. If they're moving away from your state, then you must have all kinds of problems. People move. They just do. And they move for all kinds of different reasons. And so I think you should just, look at the census numbers as a whole to understand what's happening in the United States. Why are people moving east and south, and why are people leaving the Midwest generally? There are a million fascinating stories to be found in the census numbers, but don't take it as a personal comment.
Sure. With that, we're out of time for this edition of Capitol View. I'd like to thank our guests, Peter Hancock and Jason Piscia. I'm Jennifer Fuller. Join us again next week for another edition of Capitol View.